Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating educational text straight from the Orthodox Christian Church. We're looking at exactly how this traditional institution navigates, analyzes, and teaches modern concepts of gender identity and sexual orientation. It's essentially a clash of millennia-old theology meeting rapidly shifting modern paradigms. Our goal here is completely objective. We just want to understand how ancient perspectives on the human condition intersect with today's super complex social conversations. Let's get right into it. Here's how we'll map this out today. We'll start with theological foundations, move to defining identity and marriage, compare psychology versus Christian faith, then analyze adolescent identity change, and finally, look at navigating social realities.
All right, Section 1, Theological Foundations. This is the Orthodox perspective on creation and the rules that follow.
So to understand their take on modern identity, you actually have to go all the way back to the beginning of human history, the story of Genesis. The text teaches that God's original creation was just absolute perfect peace. But, as you probably know, that harmony was severely disrupted by what the church calls the fall, or the introduction of sin. And this is a huge point for them. The intense confusion we see in modern society around gender and sexuality, to this curriculum, it's not some brand new phenomenon at all. They view it as a totally expected symptom of that ancient fracture in the Garden of Eden. Basically, internal psychological struggle is fundamentally just part of the fallen human condition. To build on that theological baseline, the text points out that Genesis set up three very distinct relationships that frame human existence. You've got the boundary between the Creator and the creation, the relationship between mankind and the rest of creation, and then, crucially, the distinction between mankind itself, specifically male and female. According to the Orthodox perspective, all these relationships were perfectly balanced before sin entered the picture. So, what does this mean for the concept of gender? Well, in this theology, male and female are distinct for divine structural reason. Blurring the line between them isn't seen as just personal expression. To this text, it's viewed as an active unraveling of that original cosmic order from Eden.
Now you might be wondering, why have all these strict rules about gender and relationships anyway? To a modern secular ear, strict rules about our bodies usually sound pretty oppressive, right? But the curriculum completely flips that narrative on its head. They quote St. Paul to argue that biblical restrictions aren't cages meant to stop you from enjoying life. Instead, they're like necessary guardrails, designed to actually free you from the power of sin. It's a total paradigm shift. They frame obedience to these traditional rules not as oppression, but as the literal pathway to restoring that perfect peace of Eden inside yourself.
Moving into Section 2, Defining Identity and Marriage. We'll explore where the Church says true identity actually comes from.
This brings us to an absolutely massive concept in the text. The curriculum argues that your core identity must be found solely in Christ. It warns, pretty explicitly, that building an identity based on internal feelings or sexual attraction leads to serious spiritual issues. But get this, they go way further than that. The text asserts that it is literally a sin to identify yourself primarily as anything else, even if it's completely harmless, like being a dedicated student or a gamer or an athlete. The psychological weight here is intense. Youth are taught to completely decouple their sense of self from their hobbies, their desires, and their internal feelings. In this worldview, your identity is exclusively a relationship with Christ.
And you can really see how this strict definition applies to marriage. The text says a true Orthodox marriage requires three distinct parties: the man, the woman, and God. They elevate this by calling it an icon of the Trinity. So why the Trinity? Well, in Orthodox theology, the Trinity represents distinct persons perfectly united in one essence. Marriage is supposed to mirror that profound cosmic reality right here on earth. The curriculum makes it clear, without all three of those specific parties, a male, a female, and God, the mirror is broken. It's no longer an icon of the divine. This is exactly how they strictly enforce their traditional gender binary for marriage.
Okay, let's look at Section 3, Psychology versus Christian Faith. This is all about how the Church views secular definitions.
This is where we hit a really powerful contrast in how identity formation is analyzed. Think about secular psychology for a second. It usually defines sexual orientation based on our deeply felt human needs, who we love, who we're attached to, who we're attracted to. But the Christian perspective in this text finds that highly problematic. They argue that tying your core identity to fluctuating human desires is, well, incredibly unstable. Instead, human identity has to be rooted entirely in your relationship with God as the Creator. They prioritize this fixed, eternal point of faith over any psychological, cultural, or social shifts. Now, it's important to note the curriculum doesn't just deny modern science, it acknowledges that biological factors, psychological traits like self-esteem, and social environments all play a big role in shaping who we are. But here is the kicker. It asserts that the spiritual domain isn't just another slice of the pie, it's the overarching framework that sits on top of everything else. So biology might give you an urge, and psychology might give you a feeling. But for the Orthodox believer, that overarching spiritual reality dictates exactly how those feelings and urges are to be interpreted and managed.
All right, Section 4, Analyzing Adolescent Identity Change, where we break down the process of forming a sexual orientation.
Let's look at how they analyze adolescence, which we all know is an incredibly vulnerable time. Teenagers are constantly trying to resolve intense inner tensions. They're looking for self-esteem, which is feeling worthy of love, and self-efficacy, basically believing in their own capabilities. But I want to pause on those last 2 points, positive distinctiveness and feelings of belonging. Why are they so powerful? Well, a teenager struggling with gender identity often desperately wants to feel unique and special, but at the very same time, they have this massive, driving need to belong to a group that accepts them. The curriculum rightly points out that this emotional and sociological cocktail makes teenagers super vulnerable to rapid, confusing shifts in their identity.
The text actually breaks down this psychological formation into a 3-stage timeline. Stage 1 is all internal awareness. The youth is experiencing inner turmoil, debating whether to accept or reject their feelings. Stage 2 is self-disclosure, like coming out to a friend, which rapidly builds interpersonal momentum. And then Stage 3 is the full construction of a group identity, where they adopt the values and labels of a specific community. The text uses this analysis of change to give a major warning to youth leaders. Be incredibly patient. If a teenager is in the fragile first stage, heavy-handed condemnation might actually push them right into Stage 3, just out of a desperate need to find a supportive community. It's a really fascinating psychological insight applied to ministry.
Finally, Section 5, Navigating Social Realities. This is about speaking truth in love without homophobia.
This final section is a really fascinating tightrope walk. The book is actively redefining homophobia for its youth, drawing a hard line between societal definitions of bigotry and theological definitions of sin. On the one hand, it fiercely condemns physical violence, online bullying, and even casual slang or poor humor. They make it clear that is completely unacceptable homophobia. But on the other hand, it vigorously defends the theological right to respectfully disagree with a lifestyle. Now, to much of the secular world, that disagreement is homophobia. But to the church, disagreeing while refusing to condone the action is the literal definition of hating the sin while truly loving the individual.
They even role-play social scenarios to train their youth. For instance, if a friend comes out to them, it provides a literal list of things you should absolutely not say. Don't say, "What happened, bro?" because that causes shame. Don't say, "I knew it," because it breaches vulnerable trust. But look at that very last example. The text strictly warns against saying, "Yeah, that's fine, it's normal." Under this theological framework, empathy cannot cross the line into endorsement. Normalizing what the church views as a sin is seen as actively damaging to the friend's spirit. It perfectly captures their perspective. You must fiercely love your friend, but you absolutely cannot validate the action.
As we wrap up this explainer, we're left looking at a profound friction between these differing worldviews. We've seen how an ancient reading of Genesis, a super rigid definition of identity in Christ, and a careful analysis of adolescent change collide head-on with our modern reality. So it really begs the question, how do deeply held traditional frameworks, like the ones painstakingly taught in this Orthodox curriculum, continue to shape the broader modern conversation around human identity, psychology, and belonging in an increasingly secular world? It's a dynamic that will definitely keep provoking vital discussion. Thanks so much for joining me to explore this text today.